In the voice thread for this lab, I talk about how zonal statistics works in the theoretical vein, and hopefully that made some sense. But honestly, I think to understand zonal statistics, it requires seeing it operationalized and thinking through what's happening. Similarly, I think doing zonal statistics, and fundamentally with zonal statistics we're taking data and we are re-aggregating it, I think you learn a lot about how rasters work and what you can do with them. So I think it's a great tool in multiple different ways. The idea with zonal statistics is we're taking a raster, like the elevation raster that we work with in the lab, and we're compartmentalizing it. So in this case, we're throwing in the census tracts, and we are then asking questions about not elevation, but about tracts. And so we're saying, which tract has the highest average elevation? Now, why do we say average? Well, zoom into any tract and you'll see that each tract is made up of cells. And so to know the average, what we're doing is we're just taking all the cells in a tract. What if they're partially in one tract and partially in another? Any cell that is 50% or more inside a tract is associated with that tract. It's rarely the case it's a 50-50 tie. I bet the rule is if it is a 50-50 tie, make it random. In any case, we're looking at all the cells in a tract and asking, what's the average value? The value of each of those cells is how many meters above sea level is it? And so the average value is the same thing as the average elevation of that tract. How do you calculate the average? You take all of these cells and you add their values together, and then you divide by the count of the cells. How many cells are there in the tract? And so when we use zonal statistics, what we're doing is we're taking that input raster, all of the region and elevation for the entire region, and we're compartmentalizing it. We're zoning it. We're dividing it up. Now, operationally, how do we do this? We do this by taking a vector and dropping it on top of that raster. We could use a raster. And in the lab, I have you use a raster. I have you use the NLCD, and then what you're getting is what is elevation or slope by land cover type. And what you learn from that is that the land covers like forest are in the highest slope areas. Why? Because where it's flat, stuff's built. That's just how the pattern of human development works. So with zonal statistics, we can ask and answer questions like, which tract in this region has the highest elevation on average? Well, you can kind of see it's one of these tracts up here. Which tract has the lowest? Which tracts are at the median? So we can get information about elevation aggregated by tract using zonal statistics. Now, the important thing to notice about zonal statistics is it lives in the Spatial Analyst Toolbox. And within Spatial Analyst Toolbox, you'll notice that there are different tools like neighborhood, and I think there's a block or a local function. Yeah, local function. Different functions with rasters operate at different scales, which is an important thing to note if you continue working with rasters in your future. It's a helpful thing to know. But there are a whole bunch of tools that allow you to work with zones, in this case, tracts. So we're taking those census tracts, dropping that whole mesh of them on top of our raster, and gathering information about each one of those tracts. How many cells are there in it? What is the average elevation of them? So adding up their values and dividing by n. There are a lot of other statistics that we gather as well. So when we do this, we use, in our lab, zonal statistics as table. Now, some of you may have used zonal statistics for this operation and put in tracts as the zones. I suggest putting GeoID in as the zone field, and then I'm going to use the elevation raster. I'm going to call the output of this, sorry, it's not on your screen. I'm going to call the output of this elevation by tract. Why do I do that? Because I'm taking elevation and I'm aggregating it by tract. So I've got information about elevation, but it's not, I no longer know each cell's value. What I know is things like how many cells are in the tract, what's the average of the cells. Now, if you accidentally used zonal statistics, what you ended up with, and here you'll notice that by default this is using the mean, what happens is you feed in a raster, zone by zone by zone, it recalculates, it creates a new raster, and the value of each cell in the raster is the average elevation of all the cells in that zone. So it's giving you the zone average displayed on screen. So when we run that zonal statistics operation, we get this. Now what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at our original raster where it would appear. Now I just turned off the tracks outlines. And so if we zoom in, let's pick a spot where there's some contrast right in here. You'll see that it looks like we're looking at tracks until you get really close and aha, it's a raster. So these are individual cells, and all of these gray cells right here have the same value. What is the value? It's the average elevation of all the cells in that tract. Now hopefully you didn't make that mistake, but even making that mistake can be useful because I think it may help you understand how this is working. But with zonal statistics' table, we're doing the same thing. We're saying, let's take this elevation raster and let's cut it up into zones. Let's use the track shapefile to do that. Now the important distinction between this and the zonal statistics that we just ran is the output of this is not spatial data. It's not a shapefile. It's not a raster. It's a table. It's just a data table. And that data table is going to have a whole bunch of statistics in it. The one we're going to be interested in, let's say, is the average. What's the average elevation of each tract? To gather that information, we're going to take a data table, make sure that we have something that we can use as an identifier to connect it back to those tracks that we're using as zones. And so here, I'm going to be real deliberate about taking that GeoID field, because this is going to give me the means to take this data table and relate it back to a spatial object so that I can draw a picture of it. So be careful when you do this to use the zone field, GeoID. And if you aren't sure about why we're using GeoID, recall in our previous labs, that is a unique identifier. It's an 11-digit number that allows us to refer to each tract uniquely. Now I'm going to give this one a name again. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to tell it what raster I'm working with, which is elevation. And then I'm going to carefully save it in my lab B folder, and I'll call this elevation by tract again. And when I run this operation, and remember when you run the operation, the result is a data table in zonal statistics' table. It's not a spatial file. It doesn't have spatial properties. And so the key to understanding what you've done is to take a look at the results in that data table. So here's zonal statistics merged. Here's the file I created. And when I open it, what I'm looking at is zone by zone various statistics. What does that mean? That means here I've got a zone for every polygon in that original shapefile. So this is created, you can see down at the bottom, 477 zones. I think, well, that's not how many zones I'm looking at. This is 2020 census data that we're looking at here, so it may be different from, I think there were 469 tracts in the 2010 census in the 3-county area we're working with. So you'll notice here's the GeoID. That's the thing we added, right? When we set this up, we said collect the GeoID. Why did we do that? Because if we didn't, we just have a bunch of columns showing us how many, showing us various statistics about these tracks, but we wouldn't be able to see which one's which. The GeoID allows us to say this tract is this tract. And you'll see it's collected a bunch of information. It's told us the zone code. That's the same as the object ID. It's not a number that's particularly useful to us, but it also gives us a count. What is that count? Well, that count is how many cells are in that raster within each zone. So you'll see there's this first row has 9,687 of these 30 meter by 30 meter cells. So you can think of count as being how many cells are in that zone total. And remember, if they're bleeding across a zone, whichever zone has more of the cell, it goes with that zone. Which means the raster doesn't perfectly replicate these lines, the outlines. It's a little chunkier than that. In addition to the count, it takes that count, it knows the projection that we're working with, and it calculates the area. This area would be in square feet. How do I know that? Because that's the linear unit we're working with, because these data are in state plane. It gives me the minimum elevation, the maximum elevation. It gives me the range, which is the maximum minus the minimum. And it gives me the average. That's the one I'm really interested in. What's the average elevation of all those tracks? How does it collect the average? Well, it calculates the sum first. It adds together the elevations, in this case of all 9,687 cells, and then it divides it by the count. And that gives us the mean, the average elevation of all of those cells. Collects a few other things, the median, that's what we're going to work with in the lab, and it also collects the 90th percentile, I believe. So there's the standard deviation. So it also gives us a measure of variability. So how far from that average are most of the cells? So basically you can think if the standard deviation is low, that's telling you that it's a tract that's pretty flat. If it's high, there's a lot of variability within that tract. So that's what we get when we do zonal statistics as a table with a continuous measure like elevation. We can also do zonal statistics as a table using a nominal measure like the land cover. And when you do that, you get a totally different set of statistics. You get things like the variety, which is telling you how many different values from this list here show up in that tract. Now keep in mind, with a nominal data set like land cover, we're working only with frequencies. So we can talk about what's the maximum, which is to say which of those land cover types is most predominant, most common in each tract. What's the variety? Again, that's how many different land cover types are present. I think it can give you, it gives you the majority and the minority. So of those present, which is least common, and of those present, which is most common, and then of how many different land cover types are present. Those are the things you get when you do zonal statistics on the land cover data set. So depending on what your data input is, you get different outcomes, but they're all doing fundamentally the same thing. They're taking a raster and compartmentalizing it by a zone or by a set of zones that you're using vectors to define. So it's a pretty cool tool. It's a way of getting data from a raster into an analysis with vector data, which is very, very useful down the line if you keep doing GIS.